welcome back to another episode of the Physiology and Philosophy podcast. Today's episode is round 2 with Dr. Carlos Ugrinowitsch, and we cover all things related to muscle damage and its importance or lack of importance for muscle hypertrophy. We cover the notion of no pain, no gain as it relates to muscle growth, and in his opinion, it's his most influential contribution to the exercise science field, which, if you listen to the first episode, I mentioned that Carlos is a very well-established researcher in a variety of domains within the exercise science space, and his work in this particular topic, again, is very meaningful and has been received very well by the community. So it was an honor to be able to discuss it with him, and we cover the specifics of the mechanisms, but we dive into the practical applications. We go into the weeds as well with its relationship to not only bodybuilding but to sport performance and everyday lifters, and it was one of my favorite conversations that we had. We did this one in person, so it flows a little better, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. All right, Dr. Ugrinowitsch, welcome back to the Physiology and Philosophy podcast. We've discussed since our last episode that today we would talk all things related to muscle damage and its importance or lack of importance for muscle growth. Are you ready for it?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here again. I hope you guys have enjoyed our last conversation. And today, this is a very interesting topic that we'll have a lot to discuss.
Yeah.
Okay?
So just to set the framework, I think most people in the field and around the time frame of 2010 widely accepted the fact that there was 3 factors from resistance training that were associated or important for muscle growth. And those were mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. Before we dive into your work on muscle damage, could you just provide a brief overview of what those 3 factors are?
Yes. Okay, so basically, whenever we lift weights, our muscles, they have to contract, to shorten, to produce force. And in this process of shortening during the concentric phase of the lift and the lengthening of the eccentric phase of the lifting, several proteins, so our muscles are basically built over proteins, different protein types of proteins. So the extracellular matrix that basically provides like a structure, to have your muscles inside, to build your muscles. And then you have the cytoskeleton, so you have proteins that just provides the structure within the muscle fibers, so it can contract or elongate, producing force, And then we have the actual contractile proteins like actin and myosin. Okay. So the mechanical stress idea is that in order to activate the mechanism that will make your muscle tissue or your muscle cells to increase protein synthesis, and as a consequence have more protein accretion and increase the volume. So the muscle needs to undergo some sort of tension. Right now, from the literature, we know that about 20% of your one-arm load is the kind of threshold where we can start seeing muscle growth. Below this 20% threshold, we don't see muscle growth. Muscle damage. So the literature on muscle damage, it's very broad, I would say. And the main idea behind the association between muscle damage and muscle hypertrophy is that whenever we we lift weights during the eccentric phase of each rep, so when your muscles are elongating, producing force, the ultrastructure of the muscle will undergo like very high tensions, and this structure may be damaged. So we may have like breakdown of proteins or membranes and things like that. And after this damage, where this muscle has to be repaired. And doing this repair, we activate the protein synthesis mechanism. And when you activate the protein synthesis mechanism, you synthesize protein a little bit more than what it's expected. Then you have a little bit of protein accretion above what it was like the homeostasis, how can I say, rate, so that you keep your muscle mass, and then the small increase in protein synthesis will, in the long run, produce the muscle hypertrophy. Okay?
Cool.
And the metabolic stress. The point of the metabolic stress is that usually when you exercise, your pH becomes more acidic, and then you activate intracellular pathways that can also increase protein synthesis. The relationship between metabolic stress and muscle hypertrophy, in my opinion, the data value, it's I would say the equivocal or sometimes even anecdotal, because we haven't been able to pinpoint how this metabolic stress can increase the protein synthesis. Especially the myofibrillar protein synthesis. That's the protein related to the most abundant proteins in the muscle, the contractile proteins, actin, myosin, troponin, tropomyosin, and so on. Okay?
So if you lift with about 20% or at least 20% of your 1RM, you will have enough tension to initiate the hypertrophic response?
I wouldn't say to initiate. You can have some hypertrophy.
Okay.
Below that, it's kind of, we haven't had reports in the literature, from my knowledge. Okay?
And the muscle damage, it makes sense where if you through elongated eccentric contractions or even coupled actions, you have damage, and then through the repair process, you can measure increases in muscle protein synthesis, and you would associate that with repairing tissue and ultimately growing. And it for so long, I think, is a proxy by lifters that it's the recovery and growth process, the whole no pain, no gain.
Exactly.
So there's sound logic, and if you pinpoint the evidence of damage is associated with repair, then I think it makes sense.
It does make sense, and I would say for a couple of decades that literature has supported this hypothesis. But the work from Dr. Nozaka, a Japanese researcher from Japan, and now it's in Australia, he has done great work on exercise-induced muscle damage. And he showed, I would say 50, I don't remember exactly the first paper on the topic, but I'll just describe the process. So it's a phenomenon named the repeated bout effect, And this effect is related to the fact that whenever you are naive or to a given exercise, or you are untrained, and you perform a resistance training session, you're gonna have the exercise-induced muscle damage. So just if you are naive to the exercise or you are untrained, when you perform a resistance training session, this is going to impose a very large mechanical tension to the muscle, and then you're gonna have damage. And then right after this exercise bout or this training bout, you're gonna see a huge increase in protein synthesis, a very large increase in protein synthesis. And so people say that this increase in protein synthesis after the first exercise bout, when you have this damage, muscle damage, a large amount of muscle damage, so this has been associated with the muscle hypertrophy. But Dr. Nozaka showed that if you just repeat one, let me rephrase here. So you perform one resistance exercise bout, and then you have the exercise-induced muscle damage. If you don't lift weights for 6 months, and then you repeat exactly the same exercise bout, 6 months after, the magnitude of the exercise muscle damage is going to be smaller than in the first exercise session.
6 months after?
6 months, And so this is just suggesting that whenever we do a resistance exercise bout, we create a protective, or we develop a protective mechanism that will decrease the magnitude of the exercise-induced muscle damage. And besides that, Dr. Nozaka showed that if you perform like a resistance exercise session today, and then you repeat the same exercise, resistance exercise session like a week or 15 days after, the magnitude of the muscle damage will decrease dramatically. And if you perform another one, you basically won't have any exercise-induced muscle damage. So the problem with this theory is that the repeated bout effect did not support the suggestion that muscle damage could support the increase in protein since training session after training session. So this is, I would say, that's the major flaw in the theory relating the muscle protein, the exercise-induced muscle damage, the increase in protein synthesis.
So hypertrophy is typically seen, longitudinally as early as 3 or 4 weeks, but typically after 6, 8, 12 weeks of training.
Yeah.
And so if muscle damage was one of the primary factors, then you would expect to have muscle damage present throughout the process. But correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that the repeated bout effect explains that muscle damage is attenuated after as early
greatly attenuated
3 sessions.
Exactly.
Okay. Interesting. So now, can you explain how you try to take this theory of maybe muscle damage is more related to repair as opposed to longitudinal growth, and how you put that into a specific study?
Okay, so I think that people that are like listening to us, they have got the picture that when you're naive or untrained, you have the exercise-induced muscle damage, and after a few training sessions, the muscle damage subsides. Okay, but this information wasn't like put together in a design that could test this hypothesis. So in order to build a design, we had to kind of think a lot about this because it wasn't a very simple design. So we said, okay, so we got untrained individuals. Why it was so important to get untrained individuals? Because they were supposed to have muscle damage. If we got like trained individuals, they wouldn't show exercise-induced muscle damage. So that was like a very important precondition for us. And okay, so if you want to know how the attenuation muscle damage it's related to protein synthesis, we have to wait like 2-3 weeks. So like get 3 or 4 training bouts, and then if the exercise-induced muscle damage decrease, protein synthesis should also decrease, because protein synthesis should be high only when you have exercise-induced muscle damage. Okay, and say okay, so pre-training, high protein synthesis because of muscle damage. 3-4 training sessions after, exercise-induced muscle damage should subside, should be attenuated because damage is attenuated, and then like 20 sessions later, we shouldn't see any major changes in protein synthesis because we wouldn't have exercise-induced muscle damage from the 4th to the 20th training session. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now we test that we got a bunch of muscle biopsies. So we gave the subjects deuterium water, so we could like mark amino acids in the muscle, so we could kind of see how much of this amino acid was incorporated to the actual protein in the muscle. So we did the pre-training exercise session, resistance training session. Then we measure muscle damage before and after this training session. After the 4th training session, we did the same thing. They did an exercise bout. They also drank the water, to mark the amino acid, and then we measured the protein synthesis. And the 20th training session, they did the exercise bout. They drank the water, and we had muscle biopsy to measure the protein synthesis. So basically what happens is that in the pre-training or in the first training session, we had a huge spike in protein synthesis. Then after the 4th week, we had like a important decline in protein synthesis. And then the 12th session, protein synthesis was basically the same, you know. And then, as expected, muscle damage was high in the first session, after the first session. Greatly attenuated after the 4th, and basically undetectable after the 20th training session. And so we showed that the protein synthesis, the increase in protein synthesis after the 4th and 20th training session was attenuated, and muscle damage was attenuated. And then we performed an additional analysis in which we showed that only after muscle damage is attenuated, the association between protein synthesis and muscle hypertrophy was high. So we get up to like 0.96.
Oh, wow.
So a really, really high correlation between protein synthesis and muscle hypertrophy. And in the beginning, so when we had after the first exercise session, when we had this huge spike in protein synthesis, the protein synthesis was not related to the muscle increasing size. So what we conclude from that is that the initial increase in protein synthesis, it's oriented to repair, when later on in the training process, the protein synthesis, it's at that moment oriented to the muscle hypertrophy.
Well, so at the end of the study, damage was almost undetectable.
Yes.
And muscle protein synthesis was lower than in the beginning, but it was still elevated.
It was after each exercise session, we had a elevation, not like a huge elevation, small, but this small increase was related to the muscle hypertrophy.
Wow. Okay. So, and now the theory behind why that is that in the beginning, it's tough because you associate muscle growth with muscle protein synthesis, but even though muscle protein synthesis is elevated after the initial session where you can see damage, that muscle protein synthesis response was not correlated with the...
Because it was oriented to the muscle repair and not to the muscle growth.
But in the middle and the end of the training, MPS was elevated, but damage was not there.
Yeah, exactly.
So in conclusion, muscle growth is not muscle damage is not necessarily a prerequisite for
muscle.
hypertrophy.
Yes, exactly.
But the remodeling and the muscle protein synthesis response in the beginning is just that. It's remodeling and repairing and not growing.
Exactly.
But to play devil's advocate here, you
go ahead.
You still saw muscle damage in that program, and
at which time point?
In the beginning.
In the beginning.
There was some damage and there was some growth in total. Has there been any studies that have done a protocol that has initiated no damage at all and still shown muscle growth?
As far as I know, no.
Okay.
But now I'm going to be the devil's advocate, because I think that we have a very interesting point that we should discuss. And of course, what I'm going to say here, not necessarily is true, but it's a hypothesis that at some point I would like to test. So the point is this. So the major counterpoint against the relation between muscle damage and hypertrophy is provided by practitioners, like bodybuilders and people like that, because they say, wow, how is that possible? So you are saying that we have this exercise-induced muscle damage, but after each training session, I'm still sore. So that's an important point. So people need to understand two things. We have two ways to measure exercise-induced muscle damage. The first one is the direct method, that when you take a piece of the muscle, so we do a muscle biopsy, and then we look at the sample under the microscope, and we can find little small pockets of immune cells. So that means that we have some sort of inflammation there.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an immune response. So that's an important point. And the other way that we have to measure exercise muscle damage is through indirect markers. Okay, and the indirect markers are, and as usually we measure all the indirect markers to say we have damage or not. So the first one, it's muscle strength. Okay, so whenever you have exercise-induced muscle damage, you have a drop in your maximal strength, and this drop is persistent. It takes like 48, 72, even 96 hours to go back to baseline. Then we have soreness, and then we have CK, protein kinase. So it's a intramuscular protein that it's assumed that when you have exercise-induced muscle damage, you kind of break down the structure of the muscle cells, and these proteins, they leak to our bloodstream so we can measure them. And then we have edema, so basically swelling,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a reduced range of motion in the tested joint, I would say. And the most important indirect marker of muscle damage is muscle force.
Okay.
Okay, muscle force is the presents the strongest correlation with direct markers of muscle damage. All the other indirect markers of muscle damage, they do not present a strong correlation with the direct marker. So soreness, I would say it's not a very good marker of exercise-induced muscle damage in the same way as CK. Okay, they are not related to the direct marker. But so the question that comes to mind is, so why do bodybuilders, they are sore after their training sessions? And this is kind of a hypothesis, and of course I have no data to support it, but pain receptors, in our muscles, they are located in the extracellular matrix. They are not actually in the muscle cells, and the extracellular matrix is much more susceptible to damage or remodeling than the muscle cells. So it may be that when we exercise, we are always kind of damaging this extracellular matrix. And what does make sense, because if you have tension in the muscle, it's like the structure it's like I'm going to use an American example. So when you have a hurricane, so a house will fall down if the structure is broken.
Mm-hmm.
And the extracellular matrix is kind of the structure of the house. So if it breaks down, then you have to regenerate this structure, and pain receptors are located in the extracellular matrix. So it is possible that you are still sore, but this soreness is not related to exercise-induced muscle damage.
Gotcha.
So it may be a different mechanism that we still have to test it.
Well, so the common proxy for damage is soreness, but you're saying decrements in muscle force is more accurate.
Exactly, it's the most important one, because it's like this. We did a study with Dr. Nozaka, Professor Nozaka, and we got Dr. Nozaka was really, really kind with us, because he provided all his data set on exercise-induced muscle damage. So let me try to present this idea in very simple terms. When we have small studies, that we investigate the indirect markers of muscle damage, what we see is that these markers, they go all over the place. They don't agree.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we measure them, they don't agree. And Nozaka provides us 365 subjects. So we had the actual data from 365 subjects. And that was a huge data set. And then we performed an analysis, where we could show that if you split the individuals in three clusters, the individuals that have a high drop in force production, individuals that have a medium drop in force production, and the individuals with a small drop in force production. So we are saying a lot of damage, average damage, and small damage. All the other variables, they align. They have like a coherent response when you have a large sample and you analyze the individuals based on the magnitude of the drop that they have in muscle force.
Huh.
Yeah, so that was another indication that muscle force was a really important marker, the most important direct marker of exercise-inducing muscle damage.
So if someone was to, read your papers where you outline that muscle damage is not necessary for hypertrophy, and they wanted to apply it in the sense of, okay, I never need to feel sore.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be careful because soreness might not be damage. So there's still some work that needs to be done. You need some tension, likely some overload, some accumulation of work.
Yes.
But you don't have to go excessive with the damage.
Exactly. And just since we are discussing muscle hypertrophy, I would say a couple of years ago, a review paper from Dr. Fry's group, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not very good in remembering names and all that stuff. They had like a huge, a very interesting discussion on this topic. And so basically what they got like a muscle fiber, and the cytoskeleton is just like, we have this extracellular matrix that gives the structure to the muscle, and then within a muscle fiber, we have the cytoskeleton that helps to provide structure to the myofibrils and to the force production units, I would say. And there is a protein that's named integrin, that crosses the membrane of the muscle fibers, and it's amazing because they got like a very, very sensitive tweezer, and they pulled this protein, this integrin, and as soon as they pulled the integrin, this integrin, it's attached to the chromatin of the DNA inside the nucleus, the nuclei of the muscle cell, and then 5-10 seconds after they were able to see an increase in mRNA expression, which means that whenever you increase mRNA expression, that means that you can synthesize more protein. So they kind of provide some a very mechanicist idea of how mechanical tension could increase muscle proteins. This is just like an addendum, but I think that's important to discuss that.
So the act of pulling the protein with the tweezer was not to remove it, it was to initiate tension.
Yes. No, it's kind of a simulating tension.
Simulating tension.
Yes. And when you pull this protein synthesis, it's kind of deformed the DNA, so it could open the chromatin and increase.
So we can talk about the evidence that's clearly demonstrating damage is not at least the most important factor, and there's potentially some conflicting data on cell swelling and metabolic stress, but correct me if I'm wrong, usually you need some form of tension to have hypertrophy.
Yes, of course. You need to activate the muscle fibers because it's like this. Okay, that's another important concept. So within the muscle, so like your quadriceps, we have several motor units. So motor units, one motor neuron, that comes from your brain, from your primary motor cortex to your muscles, go through the spinal cord and to the muscles. And then this motor unit, so this motor neuron innervates several muscle fibers, So the motor neuron, the muscle fibers that this motor neuron innervates, it's termed as a motor unit. So whenever you start force production, you have to activate motor units. And motor units are activated according to the size principle, Which means that motor neurons that innervate just a small number of fibers are recruited first, and the motor neurons that innervate a large number of fibers, they are recruited later on, and the process goes like this. So you have like no force, and then you increase your force a little bit. So I'll say 5 motor units are activated, small motor units, and they increase the force. So, but you want to keep increasing the force. So what do? You increase the frequency of activation of these motor units, and then they kind of fire faster, so they contract and relax faster, and this increase in motor unit activation or activation frequency increases force. But at some point, these motor units won't be able to increase the firing frequency. So what happens? Another motor unit kicks in, and increase force, and then if you still want to increase force, you need to increase firing rate. And when firing rate cannot increase force anymore, another motor unit kicks in, and so on. So this is just like a process. And the problem is that you need to activate, let me rephrase. So if you just activate small motor units, when you take like the quadriceps muscles, these small motor units represent just a small volume of your muscle fibers. So if they may undergo hypertrophy, but you won't be able to measure because you have increased just a small number of muscle fibers. So you need to activate more motor units, so more units can undergo hypertrophy, and then you'll be able to measure it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why you cannot use like very low intensity, because you won't activate a significant number of motor units to have hypertrophy, to identify hypertrophy or to measure hypertrophy at some point.
Is it as simple as you can only see growth in the fibers that you activate?
Yes.
Huh. I didn't know.
So far, that's what we know. And this concept may change, but so far, that's what we know.
So activating the entire muscle is likely going to be optimal for growth. And now, from the intensity standpoint, it was well established that as your load increases, so does, based on the size principle, the amount of fibers you can recruit.
Yes.
But from my understanding, research has shown you can see clear hypertrophy throughout the entire loading spectrum. So why do you think that's the case?
Carlo De Luca, an Italian professor that now resides in the U.S., he put forward a very interesting idea. So he tested this idea. So he had like a special electrode that you insert in the muscle, and then you could track the activity of the motor units. And basically what he shows that if you just if you go for QRMs, so very heavy lifts, then probably you're going to activate all the available motor units because you need to produce a really high force, But when you have like a submaximal or a moderate intensity, I'd say like 60% of the 1RM load, then what happens? Each time that you perform a rep, you have to activate the small motor units and some of the fast motor units. You don't need all because the force is submaximal, it's not maximal, okay? But if you just keep repeating the same movements, the fast motor units, they are not fatigue resistant, they fatigue really fast, okay? Then when they fatigue, they stop firing. So your force would start decreasing. But the problem is that you have an additional pool of fast motor units that are kind of fresh. They haven't contract. So they kick in and they maintain force production. Okay? And then at some point they will also fatigue, and then another group of fast motor units will kick in. So if you keep repeating this, you're lifting up to like the concentric failure, so you cannot lift the weight anymore. That suggests that all the available motor units have been recruited through this rotation of the motor units. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you can get motor unit recruitment through two ways.
Exactly.
One, high force, and also it kind of seems counterintuitive that you want to fatigue your muscles to increase activation, because you associate fatigue with impaired force production.
Exactly.
But it sounds like you need fatigue to, tap in the next guy.
Well, it's like that. And De Luca, he kind of an old school guy, I would say, but he had some really cool ideas that I do appreciate. So he suggests that we have two kind of fatigues. One is that he named physiological fatigue, so it's what is changing inside your muscles as you fatigue, and the other is objective fatigue. So the point here is this: so you try to maintain force production, so your body has mechanisms to keep force production even though you're getting tired.
Yeah.
And then at some point when you cannot maintain force production, then you have objective fatigue, because you can see the drop in force production.
Gotcha.
So that's basically the idea.
All right. I know we're bouncing around a bit, but I just want to see if I'm connecting the dots here. It seems like mechanical tension and mainly the recruitment of a lot of motor units and muscle fibers is essential for hypertrophy. Damage is more associated with the repair and is attenuated rather quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And most people associate soreness with damage, but force is actually a better indicator.
Exactly. Of the muscle damage, not of extracellular matrix damage.
Yeah, to me that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, in the sporting context, so taking a break from hypertrophy, we often try to gauge the athlete's readiness, and usually I think the best approach is a subjective and an objective component, but I don't know if it's widely understood that a reduction in force is more accurate than subjective soreness. So I feel like a lot of times what practitioners will do is they'll do like a counter movement jump where you can see changes in peak force, but I wonder if there might be a better assessment to gauge damage or readiness that's a better accurate representation of like force production capabilities. And the other thing that I think, whether you're an athlete or just a general a lifter who wants to grow, you associate soreness with work. So a lot of people aren't happy if they're not sore.
Exactly.
So I think your data can at least support the notion that if you're not dead, you can still grow, and it's probably a good thing because you can do another session.
Exactly.
And that's even for hypertrophy, but I know just watching the strength coaches I've worked with interact with athletes, when you're doing strength and power training, you don't want to be sore at all, especially if you want them to be able to, again, perform the next day or maintain these like high velocity adaptations. And I was surprised to see how athletes would subjectively rate a coach. They're like, we would ask them, what was it like when you worked with this team? And sometimes they would associate not being sore as like not doing work. So it seems convoluted in this sense.
Exactly. And my take on this, I'd say it's very particular, because when you train athletes, from a mental or psychological perspective, feeling sore is just an important component because they are showing the resilience to undergo all the different training sessions, different training protocols, and so on. But on the other token, there is a major problem here because usually we think that the more we train, the better we will get.
Mm-hmm.
And that may not be a useful perspective, especially in team sports, where the performance of the team, it's more dependable on how the players interact than the physical condition of each one of the players. Because physical condition is just a small aspect of it. So, in my opinion, athletes should train to improve, not to feel sore.
Yeah.
And you need to remember that the last, I'd say, let me rephrase here. So when you deal with athletes, the idea would be to optimize the training load so they could improve the most with the least damage, or the lowest stress to their body structures. And that's something that when you always need to be sore, that's not the case, because whenever you're sore, you are also tired. That means that you're pushing yourself a lot.
Yeah, I sport's tricky because ultimately you want an athlete to be able to tolerate load and in the course of a season, but also the course of a game. And your windows for development are typically small, where in season they have so much on court load that it's difficult to develop. And I think what you don't want to do is impair. I know, like, as a strength coach, the last thing you want in season is it's tough. You don't want your athlete to be sore where they can't participate in the game.
Well, but the problem is that this soreness, that's another important concept, if you allow me, Jake. The problem is that this soreness, once you warm up and you don't have muscle damage, you're going to perform, your performance won't be affected. Yeah. That's the point.
But there is a psychological component to it as well, where you can create a narrative in your head of, I'm sore, I'm weaker, I'm going to fatigue quicker.
Exactly.
Where on the opposite, you want to make them feel robust and fresh.
Exactly.
But they need stimulus to maintain their strength and power.
Yeah, and that's the point. You brought up a very interesting point. So in season, the major point may not be to increase the strength, to increase power, but to prevent detraining, so decrease in strength and power, because that's related to performance, and it's also related to the occurrence of injuries. So the whole point would be to maintain, and we know that with 1 or 2 resistance training sessions per week, you're going to be able to maintain your force and power, or your strength and power levels throughout the season.
So in season training, 1 to 2 sessions, would you go high intensity, low volume, or would you go moderate intensity, maximum output?
It depends. It depends on the recovery time, because we have 2 types of fatigue. One that it's named high frequency fatigue, that occurs when you perform very high intensity, low volume activity, and the low intensity fatigue when you perform lower intensity, not low, but lower intensity and more and longer duration. Of course, these concepts are not well defined in practice, but what we see is that when you have a high intensity, low volume training session, usually athletes recover fast. But when you have a longer training session, so a more of a endurance strength training session with more reps, more sets, that usually takes longer. Okay? Why? Because usually high frequency fatigue subsides in a few minutes, and low frequency fatigue can stay there or impair performance for like even 24, 48 hours.
If we're talking motor unit recruitment, before you walked me through how the load requirement from heavy loads increases activation, and the reps with fatigue increases activation as well. Can you also, through power training and at a lighter load but with maximum intent, can that also be a way to increase motor unit recruitment?
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, power training for sports that require power, of course, it's I would say that it's a way more appropriate way to train than like heavy liftings. Why? Because when you perform like power training, so like velocity-based training using high speeds, what happens is that so remember that I said that you need a force threshold to activate the motor units. When you perform, when you produce force as fast as possible, you have 2 changes that are really important for performance. First, you have a reduction in the force threshold that you activate the motor units. So most of the motor units, they're activated sooner, and they start firing at a higher frequency.
Whoa.
So that's like an important adaptation. If rate of force development, it's an important requirement for your sport.
So I know there's some debate on if plyometrics can sort of...
Okay, we are switching gears from muscle damage to plyometrics.
I want to just finish this off. There's debate on if you can bypass the size principle with plyos. But let's just say for all intents and purposes, you usually have to start, or you have to start with lower threshold motor units and gradually increase. But from an adaptation standpoint, if you use moderate loads at a high velocity, you can decrease the activation threshold for the high motor units.
Yes, so you would require a lower force threshold to activate these motor units. And one thing that you said that for me it's important, I'd say that 4 or 5 decades ago, a researcher, he tried to identify possible reversals in the motor unit activation pattern. And he showed some occasion reverse. So some fast motor units would kick in sooner than in small motor units. But now technology has developed a lot, and from my understanding, we have no empirical evidence of reversal of the size principle. So when we train, when we perform like power exercise, so we don't reverse the order of the motor unit activation, but we just compress this activation of the motor units. So they start sooner and at a higher frequency, and then your rate of force development goes up.
Very cool. I could stay on this topic for a while, but I want to keep things a little more succinct here. I want to talk about one more concept, and I'll give you 2 options, and I'll let you sort of pick which one you're more interested in. We've talked about tension, we've talked about damage, and we've briefly talked about metabolic stress. As typically with hypertrophy training, you associate moderate loads, you get the pump where you have this metabolic stress, and then you are also associate resistance training with this increase in anabolic hormones post-exercise. I know there's been some recent discussions on the necessity of those hormones for growth. So I'll leave it up to you if you want to briefly discuss the importance or lack of importance of metabolic stress or the post-exercise rise in hormones. Which are you more?
So you just keep asking me questions. So let me try to answer then both questions in a short format, I'd say. So from our work, especially the work that I've done with Dr. Libardi, it's another Brazilian researcher, we use, it's kind of a device that can measure the degree of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin in the tissue, in the muscle tissue. And we did like a blood flow restriction resistance training, so low intensity with blood flow restriction. And from my knowledge, that was the only paper that showed an actual correlation between the degree of deoxygenated hemoglobin, because that means that your muscle is using oxygen to synthesize ATP, and the muscle hypertrophy. We got a correlation. I would say I don't remember the values precisely, but it's either 0.74, 0.76. So it's a decent correlation. So from my perspective, that's the only more direct, because association is not direct relationship, showing that metabolic stress may have an effect on muscle hypertrophy. And regarding the necessity of hormones to muscle hypertrophy, that's a very controversial topic. And basically it's like, so a short answer, but I think that we can have another meeting to discuss this topic. I think that it's going to be more productive. But basically the whole idea is this endocrine response that you have after an exercise bout, so this increase in hormones, so like testosterone, IGF-1 and so on. So this endocrine response to resistance training that occurs like 30 minutes after it, it's not related to the muscle hypertrophy. That's also a very interesting topic, and I would say that Dr. Stuart Phillips from McMaster in Canada, from McMaster University in Canada, has provided most of the hard data that we have on that.
It seems like the the field is evolving in the sense of what was once thought to be necessary. I don't know if we know what's necessary yet, but I think we're, from what I'm understanding from what you're saying, we're starting to identify certain factors that maybe aren't as essential
Yeah,
as we thought.
yeah, but there's an important point that needs to be made. Research in our field usually has like a small number of subjects. Measurements are not very well controlled. We don't have like reports of error rates and so on. So I would say that we need like large scale studies to provide strong evidence on this mechanism that we are talking about. You know, even the study that I mentioned, you know, from my group, I'd say that we need more evidence on that side to make like a stronger claim that muscle damage is not important.
In a research paper, you have to be very precise with what you're talking about, and you can only generalize your findings to the specific population and sample size that you study. But being that this is a more informal chat, from your perspective, what factors are important for muscle growth?
Training.
So pretty non-specifically, just mechanical tension through a variety of
See, and the problem is this. So some people say, oh, you need to periodize your training, you need to do this, you need to do that. And honestly, some people respond with really low training volumes. Some people require higher training volume. So for me, the training process should be like this. If the individual, so your client or whatever, it's responding to the training, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. So just keep doing this that you were doing. Once this individual stops responding, then you need to change. Find a way to keep the improvement. So sometimes people, in my opinion, of course, people complicate too much training. They want to say that training it's really scientific. It's really hard to find sets, reps, speed or pace of the reps and rest interval. Our body is not that sensitive.
Yeah. Oftentimes as a field, I think we argue about the small details, but I remember when we were talking about project ideas when we first started working together, and more often than not, the basics are going to work, and
Exactly.
It's keep it simple.
Keep it simple.
And I don't think that's a good take
Yeah,
home message.
yeah, and especially, of course, for athletes, you know, you can push them a little bit more, but for like regular Joes like me, you know, just exercise. You don't need to exercise a lot because at some point, a lot of training, you're gonna hurt your body. For only very gifted people can support really high training loads for long periods of time. But usually, we are not built. Most of the humans being, I would say, are not built to support really heavy loads for years, decades. You know, so that's a.
I've been trying to find, like, in my own training, that minimum effective dosage at
Exactly.
times.
That's a very, very interesting concept that you know, if you don't have time, if you just want to improve your health status, just try to find this minimal dose, and that should be good enough. Because sometimes people say, oh, you need to train for 2 hours per day. Sometimes that's not feasible.
Yeah. Not to take us on another tangent as we wrap up here, but
come on, Jake, we are just floating around here.
No, it's related.
It's okay.
There's
joking.
a growing body of research on the topic of, like, exercise snacks, where it's just like short bouts of, you know, running upstairs or doing a lap or just like 2 or 3 sets of resistance training. And I think it coincides with getting a stimulus, but also being able to maintain it and do it repeatedly and make it a habit, and not work out so that you're so sore that you can't work out for 4 days and then you don't want to come back. So it's, you know,
Yes.
do the basics, but make the basics suit your life and make them enjoyable, unless you're an athlete where you need to really figure out the 1%.
But especially if you are young, you need to keep in mind that you need to improve. because if you just keep repeating the same training stimulus, eventually you're gonna detrain because you're gonna get so used to that they're gonna detrain. So you need to increase the training load. And for like older individuals, middle age, old individuals, they need to decrease the rate of the decline. The decline it's inevitable. It's going to occur, but the slower the decline, the better for your health.
I like that. Maybe next time we're on, we can. I got excited when we started talking about strength and power, but maybe we can also talk about how to adjust these training variables to prevent a steep decline.
Yeah.
Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.
That was
It
fun.
was fun.